Good morning. Thank you for joining today's Appeon Community webinar. Today's webinar will focus on an enhanced feature that was originally introduced in PowerBuilder 2017, Standalone Compiler. The Standalone Compiler has been enhanced in R2, and Bruce Armstrong, Appeon MVP, and Community Volunteer will be presenting to you these enhancements. Before we get started, I did wanted to share with you that this is a community presentation, so it's on a volunteer basis, and just please keep in mind that Appeon is not making any warranties with respect to what is said during this presentation. During the presentation, you can feel free to ask questions at any time. There's no need to wait till the end. Just expand the webinar console as shown in the screenshot, and go ahead and answer as many questions as you have. In case we don't answer your question during the webinar, we will answer it via email after. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce Armstrong, and he'll take it away.
So first we're going to go over the agenda. I'm going to talk first a little bit about myself, who I am, who I work for, why you might be interested in what I have to say about PowerBuilder. We'll do an introduction into the standalone compiler. We're going to go through each tab of the project painter and look to see how the options in the project painter map to the command line arguments that you use for the standalone compiler. See what's supported, what's not. The general tab, libraries, security, run, and version. That's not actually the version, the order that they appear in the project painter. The version tab actually comes sooner than that. But there's some. We're going to go a little bit more in depth into some issues with the version tab features. So that's why we saved that for last. And then we'll look at the command line help that's available in 2017 R2. And then we'll have questions and answers. So first, about me, I think most people probably know who I am already. I've been talking about PowerBuilder for many, many years. Back originally with Team PowerSoft, then Team Sybase. I was an SAP mentor. Now I'm an Appeon MVP. I was the editor of the PowerBuilder Developer Journal back when that was in print. It means I've spent a lot of time on news groups and forums, writing blog articles, doing webcasts like this, telling people how to use PowerBuilder. A company I work for is called Integrated Data Services. I joined them in 2004. They've been around since 1997. Prior to that, I was an independent contractor doing PowerBuilder work. The company I work for, when they originally were founded, their main thing was a client-server PowerBuilder application that they marketed. They have migrated that application for the most part to HTML5 JavaScript. We do have a few customers though that prefer to stay with the client-server version, so we are still using PowerBuilder and doing PowerBuilder work. Okay. So the standalone compiler was first introduced in PowerBuilder 2017, not R2, just the original 17. What it's primarily used for is for shops who perform routine, perhaps daily builds of their PowerBuilder applications. And usually you want to do that, well, first of all, to make sure you get a good compile, but also if you're doing any manual or automated testing. Now, like I said, we were a shop that lived off of a PowerBuilder application that we marketed, and we did daily builds, and we did both manual and QA testing on every daily build. So this is something that we've been using we haven't been using the standalone compiler, of course, because it hasn't been available until now, but we used other tools to do automated builds. Now, while you can perform command line compiles using the PowerBuilder IDE, you still can. It does require an additional license for the IDE, and it has some drawbacks. If you encounter certain issues during the compile using the PowerBuilder IDE, What the PowerBuilder IDE wants to do is display a message box. Well, given that it's running automated, there's nobody there that can see the message box and respond to it. So what happens is your build just freezes, and you don't get an error message, you don't get an error code, you just get a frozen a build, and then you've got to go research why we got a frozen build. Now, an initial problem with the command line compiler is it didn't support every available option in PowerBuilder Project Painter. And so what was introduced in PowerBuilder 2017 R2 is support for essentially all the options that weren't supported in the original release. There are still a few that aren't covered and likely will never be. And we'll go into those in some detail here a little bit later. Now, if there are certain features that, certain options that are in Project Painter you feel you must absolutely have, and they aren't covered by the standalone compiler, you can still use the PowerBuilder IDE, or you could use a tool from eCaring called PowerGen, which would support all the command line, all the Project Painter options. But for the vast majority of customers, I'm sure that the standalone compiler will do the trick. So here's the General tab, and I've color-coded this. So white indicates this was a feature that was supported back in the initial release. The executable file name, the resource file name, whether or not it was Windows Classic style or the new style controls, whether you were compiling for 32-bit or 64-bit, whether you're doing a machine code compile. There were a couple of other options here that were supported in the initial release but weren't mentioned in the documentation. And that's whether or not you were doing an incremental or full rebuild. That's actually not in the documentation as of R2 as well. It does show up in the command line help though. And you'll notice down here at the bottom of this screen of the Project Painter, it shows you what the arguments would be for whatever your Project Painter is currently set to. So if you toggled here between incremental and full, you would get the /I or /F down here. So if this is how you were getting the commands that you were going to pass to the command line compiler, you would have been fine. It would have actually done the incremental or full compile for you. The only problem was is if you were reading the help, you wouldn't know how to do it. And then in 2017 R2, they've added the following features: the ability to add trace to a machine code build, the error context, and optimization, and also the debug symbol, which is not just a machine code build, but is for any build. So those are all now options available in 2017 R2. So basically, if you look over this, about the only thing that isn't supported here by the command line compiler is right up here, prompt for overwrite. And that makes sense. You don't want an automated build stopping and prompting for user interaction because there's no user to interact. Okay, let's go to the Libraries tab. And this is the one area where we're not going to see any support. The two options here are basically right here, where you've got the DLL checkbox, and here we've got the resource file name. So if there are a bunch of libraries here, and for this particular demo, I've just got one library, but let's say there were a bunch of libraries here. You can have a resource file for each of the pibbles. Now, of course, we go back and we notice that you can also have a resource file name for the entire application. So I don't see that the lack of and this is one of the features that's missing, is the ability to specify a resource file name per pibble. That's not supported by the command line compiler. I don't see it as a huge issue because you can have the resource file name for the entire application. That doesn't seem to be much of a biggie. The other one, though, is the inability to set on a pibble-by-pibble basis whether or not the code will be put in the pibble or the executable. What the command line compiler will do every time is it will create an exe and a PBD for every pibble. Or if you're compiling machine code, you will get an exe and a DLL for every pibble. There's no option to say I don't want certain pibbles compiled into a PBD or DLL. I want them as part of the exe. That's where you need to choose whether or not this is that big of an issue for you. If this is an issue, then you can go back and do it through the PowerBuilder IDE, which will support this, or as I mentioned before, PowerGen also supports selecting which pibbles actually make it into the exe or PBD. Okay, we get the security tab. Now this wasn't supported under the original release. Support's been added for this under 2017 R2. So now we can choose what if we generate a manifest, and if so, how, whether it's an internal or external. We can set the execution level, and we can indicate whether or not we want to allow access to protected system UI. So basically, this tab's completely covered. The Run tab isn't covered, but remember that prompt for overwrite? These options are kind of like that, in that it doesn't make sense to have a command line compiler support these options. Okay, this is for if you right-clicked on the project and hit Run, what would happen? Well, that's not something you're doing with your command line compiler. So this one was basically ignored, and for good reason. So that takes us to the version tab. Okay, now nothing's changed here in R2. All of these features were supported in the initial 2017 R2 release. Okay, now there's what's particularly interesting here. You notice that there's nothing there's two sets of version information here. This is called the properties displayed for executable, and it has a product version and a file version. And this takes a string value. You can put anything you want here. Down here it says executable version used by installer, and this takes 4 numbers each. Once again, a product version and a file version. Now notice the product version for the executable version used by installer can't be set through the command line compiler, and that the file version that's used is passed through a single argument. Okay, but because these are 4 numbers and this is a string, if you put a string in here, what's going to happen is it's going to try to use it for those 4 numbers, and it's going to fail. So the only format you can put the file version in is a series of 4 numbers. So what happens is you put them in as 2.2.2.2 or whatever number sequence you want to use, and the command line compiler is going to parse that and put it in these values as well as 4 numbers. Now, to understand what's going on, why some of these are going to be an issue, is that there is a structure in the Windows API that determines how the version information is written into Windows executables and DLLs. It's called the version info structure. And it has 2 areas within that structure that corresponds to those 2 areas we saw on the project painter. There's the fixed info section, which is the series of 4 numbers, and the string name section, which is the 2 string values. Okay, so here's from the documentation on the Microsoft website. Here's documentation on the fixed info section. So we have file version, product version, and once again, it's a series of 4 numbers. And this is the string info section. So we have the file version and the product version. Okay. Here's an example. This is a tool called Resource Explorer. That's that on the left, and then on the right, I'm showing Windows Explorer. I've done a properties on a PowerBuilder generated executable. Now, what you're going to see here, what I put in for the properties in the PowerBuilder Project Painter was 1111222233334444, something like that. What you're going to see um, is next slide indicates what the issue is. So here, down here is product version. That got left set to 1.0.0.1. Now, if you use the command line compiler, that will always be the value that you'll have for the product version. You'll notice this is interesting. There's a file version and a product version shown in the Windows Explorer. Interestingly enough, it picks the file version. The dialog in the Painter, PowerBuilder Project Painter, would make you think that the string values are used here all the time. They're not. The file version actually comes off the 4 set of numbers down here, and the product version comes out of the string area. Okay. So as I mentioned before, using the command line compiler, you can't set the product version in the fixed info section. Also, using the command line compiler, it's currently not possible to set the file version in the string name section to a non-numeric string value. You've got to pass it as 4 numbers because the command line compiler is going to set it, use it to set the fixed info section file version as well. Now, it's a common practice when you set your product version and file version that you actually set them to 4. You set them both to a series of 4 numbers. And if that is the way you do your version information in your executables today, then one of these, the file version, is not really an issue because you're going to be passing 4 numbers anyway, and both of the string section and the numeric section will both get those 4 numbers. The only problem you may have is with the product version because it never gets set to anything other than 1.0.0.1. Part of the problem here is the Windows installer actually uses that product version information. So because of that, it's actually kind of important that we actually set that to a value that's unique for each version of our executable. Now, if you want to use command line compiler, so this is a workaround. I mean, you don't have to give up on the command line compiler just because of this issue. You just have to be aware of it. Now, if you went back and used the PowerBuilder IDE or if you used the eCrane product, it would set the version information correctly. But the other thing you can do is eCrane has another utility called version edit, and that's something that we've used for a while. And what that does is you can take a PowerBuilder executable that's been created someplace else, for instance, the standalone compiler or the PowerBuilder IDE or however you generated it, but you run this version edit tool on it, and it actually sets the version information correctly. Okay, so that's enough about the version tab. This is new in PowerBuilder 2017 R2. If you type in PBC 170 with a /H, it will give you help on each of the different options that's available in the command line compiler. And you'll notice there at the top, /F and /I are documented here. So this is one place they are documented. And in a future version of PowerBuilder, I'm sure they will get it into the PDF file. That's the documentation as well. Okay, in summary, the standalone compiler is now essentially complete. It supports basically every option that it makes sense to support out of the Project Painter. There's a couple it leaves out. The one is the pibble by pibble determination of whether or not the code should be placed into a PBD or a DLL. And I can, in a way, I really can understand why that's not being supported. If you've ever used OrcaScript and you try to use the PBD flags argument, that was the argument you passed into OrcaScript. You still can, to say which pibbles get created as PBDs or as part of the exe. Well, what that argument was a string of yes and no's in the order of the library list. Well, if you've only got 4 or 5 pibbles in your library list, okay, that seems yeah, that's kind of reasonable. The application we support has over 100 pibbles, and to go through 100 pibbles and create a string that's got, it's 100 Y's or no's long, and make sure that you get the right one set to yes or no, that's a little bit tougher, particularly if you've gone back in later and added a pibble, and all of a sudden your string is off. Yeah, so that's kind of difficult to manage in a command line argument-based product, and I can see that's why they left that out. So basically, I don't see this changing. I could be proven wrong, but I expect that if you're going to use the standalone compiler, you're going to have to accept that you're going to get an executable and a PBD or DLL for every pibble. Okay, that's it, and it's time for questions and answers.